Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Brandon Daniels, CEO and President of Exiger, for our fifth and concluding episode in our five-part series on the coming conflict with China. Brandon, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Great to continue the conversation.
Brandon, I thought for our final episode, we might move to some potential solutions. And it has struck me in listening to you through this four parts we've recorded previously that an integrated solution is required, literally including governments slash regulators, governments, I should say, public companies, businesses, think tanks, consultants, product providers, service providers, down to the consumers. So I was wondering if we might end by helping people think through these levels and how we're all involved in this, just as we're all involved in the fight for human rights. We're all involved for the fight against bribery and corruption, and we're all involved in the fight for democracy from the business perspective. So I know that's a lot, but how do we work with, or what's maybe the government's role in leading this?
Yeah, so the government's role really is a couple of things, Tom. First, you've got things on the Hill, right? So you've got folks like Mike Gallagher leading the China Select Committee and raising what looks like a constellation of disconnected issues, raising the fact that constellation is actually inherently connected. These are nodes and edges, right? The issues with Uyghur forced labor, the issues with cyber intrusion. We saw incredibly stealthy and sad credential theft occur in Middle Eastern telecommunications. And a group of researchers at a German IT company called Sentinel Labs raised that they all stemmed out of China. It's first, Congress has to help to bring what looks like these constellation of disparate actions together, and in things like the China Select Committee, in the Haskin, raise that these things are not disconnected. These things are interconnected, and they are a challenge that the United States and our ally partners have to meet head on. So that's the first thing that the government has to do. The second thing that the government has to do is it has to prioritize this in a way that both funding and regulation meet. Okay. So the insider threat market in 2000, I think it was 2010, Tom, was about $780 million. I think today the insider threat market is 12 billion. Okay. And how did that happen? It's because people recognized that there was an economic and national security threat that existed that insider threat mitigation strategies could help us to solve. If you look at cyber spend, right? The same thing has happened over the last 20 years. People would sign unlimited liability related to cyber intrusions in contracts without even thinking 15 years ago. And now people recognize that cyber control, cybersecurity is so critical, and people have regulated around it, right? Back in 2017, DOE set policies and was starting to communicate to FERC that the SIP had to be updated to take into account. Those are the standards that get rolled down into standards for security management, process management, utility management into the major United States energy companies, wholesale and retail energy companies. But DOE promulgated to FERC and FERC promulgated to NERC the requirements to protect all of our critical utilities, all of our critical energy pipelines with certain standards that allowed us to keep our infrastructure, right? And we've seen that go from a similarly sized industry 20 years ago to $100 billion industry, right? There's limits right now that put cyber way above 75 billion in terms of total net scale. So what happened at the same time that those rules were promulgated and then the standards were updated by NERC? What happened at the same time? Funding happened. So you were able to classify your investments into cyber into your long-term capital investments. They weren't OpEx. They were things that you could depreciate and amortize over the schedule of the construction of that utility, of that line, of that pipeline, right? In the Inflation Reduction Act, you have the ability to get subsidies and to get money to sustain your infrastructure, to revitalize your infrastructure, to modernize your infrastructure. A part of that is cyber hardening, right? And so you have funding that, if we could say a part of that also is diversification away from China and dependence on China, guess what? People would use that money to modernize, to increase the security of their infrastructure, right? There are tax benefits, there are literal subsidies that we can provide to make sure that this is a capital investment now that we get to see the benefit of over time. So, from the government perspective, it's evangelism, right? It's regulation and it's funding. And the government has to play their part. And then from a public company perspective, when you've got those incentives, those are going to align with consumer behavior. Those are going to align with business behavior. Those are going to align with all of the things that happened when we decided we didn't want terrorists or the adversary in our financial system back in just after 9 with the enhancements to the AML BSA rules or BSML rules and sanctions rules and CFT rules. When you decide that you're going to put in place those controls, the public markets are going to react. Now, the good news is we have technology that helps us to do it more cost efficiently than the old way that we built up the KYC and CD infrastructure, which is way too costly. But at the same time, it provides incentives to the public markets. But the most important part, Tom, is it incentivizes investment. There are different ways to construct lithium ion batteries. There are stationary battery alternatives to lithium ion, right? Like flow batteries that won't get investment if we don't have the demand and requirement for those battery types to support all our alternative energy. If we don't have the demand to find green molecules that we need to store at scale, then we are not going to see the public markets react, and we're not going to see the investment. So if there's regulation, that also could drive new areas of innovation. In fact, I know it will. I've already seen it. And then the last piece is what role can we play? And it's this kind of situation where you and I play a role, Tom. You and I play a role by raising awareness. And it's not to scare people. It's to make it so that the action can happen so far to the left of the boom that we never get to the boom. We have to have these conversations, and that's how we play a role too.
Throughout this podcast series, you have talked about your conversations with senior executives and other business leaders. And you've talked about how you did this in the context of a potential conflict with China. But frankly, I heard risk management and business process, and that many of the steps that you have are advocated, whether it be to identify your risks, whether it be to assess your risk and then put a risk management strategy in place and monitor that and upgrade as appropriate, are good business practices. When you talk to businessmen and explain that this is really something you should be doing anyway, or do they understand that, whether it be IP theft, whether it be another potential worldwide global pandemic, or whether it be the shutdown of a key supply market for you? Are those things that business people understand that it's really a business process they can and should be doing?
Yes, one of my best customers. They are one of the largest technology companies in the world. And the person that runs our relationship, that manages our relationship, she put together the most simple and perfect document for the executives of the company as to why they had to risk assess and change their thinking around Chinese relationships. And it had a lot of the stats that we talked about today. It was very concise, sort of corporate espionage and IP theft, human rights abuses, national security, had all of those. But at the end of the day, she said, and I've heard this before from other colleagues, good compliance is good business. And a part of it is that a conflict with China, if you're dependent on them for your semiconductors, for your chipsets, for your computers, if you're relying on them for your textiles, for your masks, for your solenoid valves that go into your ventilators, if a conflict happens, you're out of business. And so good compliance is good business. We saw that so unbelievably clearly during the pandemic. And I think we could learn something from an old adage and renew that view that good compliance process is good business process. And I think everything that you said in terms of everything that we've talked about being about process, being about decision making, being about having a considered and formulaic view of what your risk appetite is as a company is exactly right, because it's how you weather the.
Brandon, I can't think of a better way to end this podcast series. I wanted to thank you again. This has been a great learning experience, and I hope our listeners will take many of these topics to heart. Before we leave, I wanted to ask if people wanted more information on Exiger, where can they go?
I think exiger.com is the best place.
Great, Brandon. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.